In this lecture I want to talk a bit more about the risks that climate change poses to development in the South Pacific. As I was explaining in the previous lecture, the levels of development in the Pacific vary quite widely. And another way of thinking about development in terms of people, which is a quite helpful set of statistics that help give an insight into social vulnerability, is to look at the data on human development. And the Pacific Island countries, all of them are ranked in the lower half of countries in the world on the United Nations Development Programme's Human Development Index. In some countries, human development is very low, in countries like Kiribati, Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands and Tuvalu. And that means, and the Human Development Index that a country has is a composite of factors, principally educational attainment, healthcare and income. And so it's a good proxy to begin to think about adaptive capacity. And these countries are also least developed countries in the United Nations system. Now, in terms of development, it's helpful to think about the sensitivity of economies, that is the sensitivity of all the forms of production in the economies of the South Pacific, and by implication, the sensitivity of the jobs that people get who work in producing those things to climate. And so, as a general rule, the primary production sector of economies in the Pacific Islands is quite a large share of GDP, gross domestic product. And so agriculture is a fairly large share of GDP, fisheries in many countries is, forestry in some countries is. And that means that people's incomes and people's livelihoods are also quite dependent on these forms of primary production. And these are the things that are most sensitive to climate change. Fisheries tend to move around according to temperature in the ocean and the health of coral reefs. Agriculture is highly sensitive to temperature and rainfall and to extreme events and so on. And so this fact that economies and most people are quite dependent on primary resources means that development and production is as a general rule of thumb, quite sensitive and therefore quite vulnerable to climate change. And various things that we think about when we begin to look at what constitutes development, the basket of things that we would look at to say this is a more or less developed place, and therefore this is a place where life is more or less good, at some level anyway, are at risk of climate change. For example, health. So there's all sorts of health risks that climate change poses to people in the Pacific. Malaria and dengue fever are carried by mosquitoes. There's good scientific evidence to show that in warmer, wetter periods these mosquitoes breed, and infection from those mosquitoes, malaria and dengue fever, increases. So rates of infection of dengue and malaria are climate sensitive. You can control problems of malaria and dengue fever through good public health programs. There's research underway in the university that's looking about breeding out these mosquitoes that carry diseases. But you have to be able to invest in that. You have to take money. It requires good public health systems, and those are generally lacking in the region. Fresh water systems may become increasingly contaminated as a consequence of climate change. Partly this is about damage due to extreme events. After disasters, water supply systems get damaged and water may be not available. Sometimes after disasters, systems that treat sewage get damaged and sewage gets into freshwater systems, and so it can be unsafe to drink water after disasters, and there are episodes of these problems in the region. Reducing precipitation may mean freshwater storage systems are less able to provide water, and water may become more contaminated because it's not flushing as much. And groundwater, which is a major source of water in many countries, may become contaminated increasingly because there's less regeneration from rainfall, but also because of salinity from rising sea levels. Fish poisoning is a disease, a toxin that people get from eating fish, reef fish, particularly big reef fish, and it too can make you very sick. Fish poisoning, don't want to get ciguatera. And it too is linked to El Nino, and rates of infection of ciguatera seem to rise during El Nino events. Heat stress may be an issue, particularly in urban parts of the Pacific Islands, but we won't see mass heatwave mortality events in the Pacific like we have seen in Europe, for example, or North America. But there may be some increased illness and death associated with that under high rates of climate change. Skin diseases can increase. There's a little bit of evidence to show that various lesions and infections on the skin are related to climate. They're certainly related to water. Water is sensitive to climate. And hunger and malnutrition may also rise. This is likely to be as much about the prices of food, as most people in the Pacific purchase some of their food, as it is about the ability of people to produce food themselves, fish and crops and so on. So the overall picture here is one of a concern about the impacts to climate change to human health through various vectors and through various means. All of these things can be managed through well-funded, good public health systems, but low levels of income for governments in the region and various other problems mean that those capacities to manage these health risks are generally not present. So here, for example, is a informal housing in Funafuti. Talked about this in a previous lecture. These are the kinds of places where we might begin to expect quite a lot of sensitivity and potential health impacts from climate change. Fortunately, not yet. Climate change poses risk to infrastructure. It costs a lot of money to build wharves and fuel storage depots, electricity systems, water systems, sewage systems, runways, and so on. And these things can get damaged. They principally get damaged during extreme events, from storms, high sea events, strong waves, strong wind events. But progressive coastal erosion can be a problem, and the cost of replacing roads and seawalls and causeways and so on is likely to amplify into the future. Extreme events can cause some damage as well. And when you start to zoom down into the everyday lives that people live, some of these infrastructure effects can be quite significant. If the road to the hospital is inaccessible because of flooding or because it's damaged, then getting access to healthcare can be difficult at certain times when people need it. People's housing can be damaged, and housing is very expensive. The cost of materials are very expensive, and insurance is almost non-existent in the Pacific Islands. So if you lose your house, there is no insurance to help you, formal insurance, to help you rebuild it. Commercial enterprises can go down, people can lose their jobs. This happens particularly around flooding in Fiji, for example. Roads and bridges get damaged, telecommunications systems can be damaged, and so on. Now, extreme events cause these problems in the Pacific already. The question is, are they likely to cause more damage into the future? Can new infrastructure developments be built so that they are less susceptible to this kind of damage? Can existing infrastructure be strengthened and secured in some way against the changing drivers of risk that might come to them? What's that going to cost? When does it need to happen? And if it doesn't happen, what will the impact be on the cost of maintaining and providing this infrastructure because of climate change? And it could be very large. Small economies, big capital expenditure items. And if governments are spending money maintaining roads, securing the electricity system, rebuilding the schools, then they may not be spending money on other things that are also important. Education, healthcare, and so on. So it's true in most parts of the Pacific that almost everywhere are capital cities on the coast. Almost everywhere is the major transport infrastructure on the coast, the wharves, the airports, the hospitals, the energy stations and so on. And coasts are vulnerable to sea level rise as well as to extreme events. People's jobs are also at stake. There are very few people living entirely subsistence lives in the Pacific who are meeting all their own household consumption needs through their own production. People are usually buying and selling something, receiving money in one way or another and spending it in one way or another to meet some of their needs, be it some of their food needs or the cost of education or the cost of healthcare. So money does matter. And money is a question of jobs. If it's not the case that a household has a form of income, then they may directly from their own production, then often it will be money sent from a relative or a child or a family member abroad who sends money back to support consumption in the household. So jobs still matter. And jobs may be at risk. And some economies like the Cook Islands or Fiji, where tourism is a major employer, The ability of people to work in the tourism sector is very important, and tourism is sensitive to climate and maybe increasingly so. If the beaches aren't there and the reefs are damaged, if there's tropical diseases like malaria suddenly in those markets, if there's continuous damage through extreme events, then tourism sectors will employ less people and possibly pay them less. People sell fish, people sell food, people work in some economies in processing those things, in the tuna canneries, in the sugarcane refineries, in the market selling food and so on. So it's not just the producers, it's the people whose livelihoods depend on adding value to those forms of production as well, are sensitive to changes in climate. We know this because when extreme events come through, for example, cyclones and floods affect Fiji is a good place, and the main island of Viti Levu is a good place to look at this. People lose their crops, they lose their ability to sell money from those crops, they have to spend more money to purchase food to substitute for the food production that they've lost. People in the tourism sector lose their jobs, and so on. There's another issue here about infrastructure. If people who grow food or catch fish sell them in markets, then they need to be able to transport those things to markets. It means they need the roads to be working and the bridges to be operating. And extreme events can damage roads and bridges, and that means that households who may rely on selling their yams or their taro in the market once a fortnight, if they can't get there, then they go a month without getting any cash income, and that can have a significant impact on their consumption. Talked a bit about food security already. We might think about food security as having a number of elements. One is the ability to produce food, the second is to transport and store it, and the third is to utilise it. So talked about the sensitivity of various forms of production to climate already, and as well as the sensitivity of the infrastructure needed to transport and to store and to process food. These things can be damaged by climate. But it can also impact upon people's ability to access food. That's about their incomes, how much money they have to buy food, as well as the price of food. And climate change may affect both of those things. There's some evidence that it does this in various parts of the world. During extreme events or droughts or large-scale flooding events, food on local markets can become scarce and their prices rise. At the same time, the people who may have been earning an income growing that food are losing income, and so they can be caught between a period where their ability to purchase food because their income declines at the same time as the prices of food rise. And so people can get caught in this income and food price rise wedge, particularly around extreme events. And other factors come in here. The cost of energy, for example, is important. Food utilisation is the third element of food security. Are people able to consume food that is healthy and that doesn't make them sick? That's partly about their levels of health. Diarrhoea, for example, significant diarrhoea means that people can eat food but not extract the nutrients from it into their body. You need energy and clean water, generally speaking, to process food so that it's healthy to consume. And climate change may affect people's base levels of health, malaria, dengue fever, waterborne diseases and so on, as well as the supply of energy and fresh water to produce food so that it's healthy to eat. So in these three ways, through production and infrastructure, through prices and incomes, and through food utilisation, health and the availability of energy and water, we might begin to think that there are risks to food security in the Pacific Islands through various ways. Finally, let me conclude this discussion about the risk climate change poses to development by coming back to this question of infrastructure and the centralisation of all that. Some years ago there was a very interesting study about Mudgero, which is the main island and the main part of that island where the government buildings are, all the main businesses and banks are, where the wharves are, where the hospital is and where the electricity is. So the country of the Marshall Islands, which is archipelagic, the seat of government and the seat of administration, the seat of finance and the main transport hub is all in a fairly small confined area in the island of Mudgero. If that area can't be protected from sea level rise or from climate change, then this critical node, this critical location that's essential for the functioning of the country of the Marshall Islands, the capital, will be severely damaged, and that will going to have widespread implications for development and governance of that country, that whole country. So the cost, it's been estimated, to protect this commercial area And this sensitive centre of this country is 4 times gross domestic product to protect it against a 1 metre rise of sea level from a seawall like this. So the price to defend a country against sea level rise is 4 times GDP. That's a fairly significant issue about the ratio of vulnerability to costs that occurs in islands because of the problem of climate change, and it's a problem that is not easily solved. So, in various ways, the economies of the Pacific Islands are vulnerable to climate change, as are many of the peoples whose livelihoods depend on those economies.